Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending where you are. And welcome to this sixth lecture of the Middle East 101 course organized by my colleague Dr. Aisha at the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Lee Chen Sim, who's talking to us live from the UAE, from Abu Dhabi, who will be with us for the next hour and 15 minutes, discussing economic and social challenges. And more particularly, the topic of the oil and gas policies in the Middle East. Over the last weeks, we covered the topic of climate change, as well as social reforms and economic diversification in the Gulf. And obviously, if I may say, the elephant in the room is the future of oil and gas policies in the region. So to do that, it's a great pleasure to have Lee Chen Sim with us. She's a frequent speaker to our events, and thank you very much, Lee Chen, for being with us again today. Let me just say a few words on the speaker before leaving the floor for her presentation. As I said, Dr. Lee Chen is talking from Abu Dhabi, where she is assistant professor at the Khalifa University. She holds a PhD in politics from Oxford University. And I should say also she studied at NUS, did her BA here on the campus. She's a prolific writer and edited several several edited volumes. Most recently, one that we introduced during a book launch here at the Institute, Asian Perceptions of Gulf Security, which was published last year by Routledge. But let me also add another edited volume that Lee Chen Sim co-edited, and which relates directly to the discussion today, Low Carbon Energy in the Middle East and North Africa, which was published by Palgrave in 2021. Now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Dr. Lee Chen for the presentation, and after that, we'll have the Q&A with the participants. Thank you very much. Lee Chen, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Luc, for the very generous and kind introduction. It is certainly a pleasure to be back here, invited by my friends at the Middle East Institute. I was asked to speak on the region's oil and gas, obviously something I'm really happy to do because of my research interests, as Dr. Saman mentioned, but also because I've been living here in this region for close to 2 decades. So it really is heartening to see the good level of interest in the Middle East, in Singapore in particular. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Be focused, as Jean-Luc said, much on the oil and gas, but I will also look slightly at a wider picture of the Middle East. Now, I like to always start these kinds of lectures with a slide that will show exactly. I always like to start with this particular slide or this particular graphic. It's from Visual Capitalist, and it shows which items are the top revenue earners in the world. And in this case, I've zoomed into the Middle East. As you can very clearly see from the slides, the top revenue earners here in this region where I'm sitting is clearly oil and gas. And this is probably not surprising to many, I assume, Singaporeans who are tuning in, because, the Middle East is generally associated with oil and gas. Now, the reason for, so is this a true or is this a slightly false assumption? I would say that it is, by and large, quite a true picture on the one hand, because the Middle East has quite a lot of comparative advantage when it comes to producing oil and gas. It's got the correct geography for it. It's got the correct topography for it. For example, the oil and gas fields in the Middle East tend to be pretty large. and concentrated in one place. This makes exploration and production much easier. For example, compared to the US, where yes, there's a lot of oil and gas use, but they tend to be really small and scattered around different areas. So it's not as economical to exploit them because they are smaller fields. So for reasons of geography, topography, sand, as opposed to, say, permafrost in Siberia, as opposed to things like there are very small, generally, populations in the oil and gas producers, which means that the domestic population doesn't consume a lot of the oil and gas produced, which means that they can actually export it. Unlike, say, large countries like the US, where the big population tends to self-consume quite a lot of the produced oil and gas. So there is a kind of a comparative advantage in the Middle East, which is why they generally produce a lot of oil and gas. Now, having said that, the good news is that because they produce a lot of oil and gas, when oil and gas prices are really high, that's good for the Middle East economies, right? Because the more money they earn, the more income they get, the faster they can invest it in various projects, and they can grow their economies. So it was not surprising that last year, in 2022, Saudi Arabia was perhaps the fastest growing economy in the world, with a GDP growth of around, 8.7% last year. That's a stunning GDP growth, right? So that's the good news. So you can see here again, I just wanted to show you a slide on the comparative advantage. If you look at the light blue bar, you will see that that depicts the comparative production costs of oil in Saudi Arabia, which is around $3 a barrel. And this compares to, say, maybe around $10 in the US, and it can go up to over $40 in Canada, or even in Russia in some of the offshore fields. So you can see $3, it's a really low price for producing an extra barrel of oil. So that's a comparative advantage. Now, the bad news in some of this is that as the world tries to wean itself off fossil fuels, as the amount of oil in the ground gets depleted, because oil and gas are naturally depleting sources of exhaustible resources. The problem is that there's less and less oil and gas, and hence generally there's less and less revenue to be earned. And the problem here is for these oil and gas producers, they can be very, very vulnerable to the fact if oil prices drop, right? They have tried, and you can see that till today, oil and gas producers in the Middle East are still very dependent on oil revenues. If you look at the chart on the right, it shows you that despite some changes in the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, oil and gas revenues are still very important to the government budget in the Middle East, as you can see from the collective one in green. So roughly something like 60% of the budget still comes from oil revenues, and that's a really large figure. This, of course, varies across the region, and which is why you see in the chart on the left, some Middle East producers being more vulnerable to low prices of oil in the future if we get to a low carbon transition. The ones that are in the lighter reds, they are the ones that are less vulnerable to a post-oil future because they have started on efforts at diversification, right? So it pays to think about how different oil and gas producers are not quite the same in terms of their strategies to deal with a post-oil future. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that even for these oil and gas producers, the future is not really as bleak as we assume it to be, right? Because we assume Middle East equals oil and gas, post-oil and gas Middle East equals disaster. But that's not really true, because some of these oil and gas producers actually do produce other things, right? And other things of value, and that's earning them quite a decent revenue. And this screen here shows you several examples of that. At the top left-hand corner, you'll see Emirates Steel from the UAE, which is producing and selling a lot of steel, particularly to Asia, but also to Europe, where the UAE is among the top 10 exporters of steel to Europe. For those of you who, like my mom, drives a BMW car that is electric, you may know that some of the UAE's aluminum is actually in the BMW electric car because it produces solar-powered aluminum from solar-powered power plants here in the UAE, and that's considered low-carbon aluminum. Saudi Arabia, for example, also is very active in its investments in wind and in solar in different countries around the world. You see a picture there of Fast and Furious, and that depicts how the UAE also has quite a thriving movie industry, where you have Mission Impossible, Fast and Furious, filming here in the UAE. You of course have tourism in Oman. You have microchips owned by UAE companies. In fact, one of the campuses is in Singapore. And so, there are these various industries, including aluminum, which you see in Bahrain in the picture at the bottom. There are things that these traditional oil and gas producers do, apart from just oil and gas, right? So the assumption number one is not quite true, although there's a grain of truth to that. I'd like to move on and talk about assumption number two, being 2 out of 4 assumptions that I'd like to raise in this particular talk. Assumption number 2 is that there will be a rise of gas exporters in place of oil exporters. Now, traditionally, if you look at the Middle East, oil has reigned supreme over gas, right? There are many more oil suppliers here in the Middle East, and oil has traditionally been a more valuable commodity compared to gas. The oil producers do produce gas, but traditionally the gas has just been burned off because it wasn't seen to be as valuable as oil, which is one of the world's largest traded global commodity. I mean, if you think about it, most people have heard of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. But how many of us have actually heard of the GECF, which is the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, right? So traditionally, my point is that the oil exporters have gained most of the attention around the world within the Middle East. But this is changing, and I think that we should be aware of the assumption that oil always reigns supreme, and think about how gas exporters in the region are also going to play a very big role going forward, including currently. And the big change has to do with the fact that gas is now quickly actually becoming a globally traded commodity like oil. And this is because of the rise of a particular way of exporting gas around the world called liquefied natural gas, or LNG, whereby gas is super frozen and transported in really large ships around the world. And then at its destination, it is then unfrozen and made into into a gas again, and you can use it. Okay, so this has allowed gas to be transported safely and in huge volumes. Now, this technology of LNG gas is actually a game changer for a few of these gas exporting countries in the Middle East. Most of you, when I say gas exporter in the Middle East, you'll probably think of Qatar. And you won't be wrong, because Qatar is the largest gas exporter in the Middle East. But there are other gas exporters as well in the Middle East. The UAE, right, with liquefied natural gas, and you have Oman as well. They do export gas, but of course to a much smaller volume than they export oil. So think about LNG and how gas exporters are probably going to give the oil exporters in the Middle East a run for the money in terms of revenue and global influence. And part of the reason is because in a lower carbon world, in a world in which we move towards, say, renewable energy, gas is supposed to play a larger role. Not a smaller, I mean, a larger role in terms of the fact that you will need gas in order to balance the intermittency from solar and wind. Solar and wind, they're not produced all the time in enough quantities to produce electricity. And especially at night, for example, when you don't have solar, gas peaker plants can kick in to try to produce enough electricity for night use, right? At the moment, of course, we can use batteries, but batteries, to compensate for the fact that, you know, the wind and the sun don't always shine and blow, batteries are still really expensive in terms of a medium for storing renewable electricity. So until batteries get cheaper, gas peaker plants will still very much be needed to try to balance the solar and wind intermittency. So that's to keep the grid stable, so that your fridges and freezers will still work at night, for example. Okay, so gas is still going to be quite an important balancer in the electricity system until batteries actually kick in. Now, having said that, maybe some of you would think, oh, well, then in that case, Iranian gas might have a shot, right? After all, Iran has the second largest proven reserves of gas in the world. It shares a giant gas field with Qatar, which is largely unexploited because of sanctions, right? But I personally, I'm not very optimistic at the chances of Iranian gas becoming a really big thing for several reasons. Because one, sanctions, which are still ongoing in Iran, sanctions tend to be quite sticky, which means that they take a long time to be lifted or even reduced, right? So which means that the Iranian gas industry will continue to be hobbled, right, by sanctions. Even if sanctions are reduced/removed, I think many foreign companies, and Iran will need the help of foreign companies to develop those fields, to develop LNG. A lot of foreign companies will continue to be wary about investing in Iran for the fear of snapback sanctions, right? So what if you invest in a field in Iranian gas and then 5 years later, sanctions get, chucked back onto Iran, you're going to have a problem with your investment. So that there may be wariness over snapback sanctions if Iran doesn't follow through its promises. And also, I think there are nowadays many alternative LNG gas suppliers and developers in the pipeline. Obviously, you have the US, you have Qatar, you have Australia, which already play a big role in LNG. But you also have players like Oman, which is expanding its LNG. You also have Mozambique, whose projects are going to come online soon in a few years. So perhaps, the window to develop Iranian LNG gas may have passed. I'm not so certain about the future for Iranian gas, despite the fact that I think in general, gas exporters will have a higher profile in a post-carbon world. Let's move on to assumption number 3. And the assumption here, given what I've said about a post-carbon world, would be that oil exporters are finished, or in our local lingo, habis, right? Oil exporters are, that's it, done, habis, finish. And so again, with this assumption, it's half and half, right? There's some truth to it, but I think as well, we must be careful to nuance the kind of assumption that we make about oil exporters. On the one hand, it's true, right? Oil demand is falling globally, partly because, there is more demand for electric vehicles. A lot of countries, including Singapore, have put in place targets where they want to ban the sales of new internal combustion engine vehicles, your traditional cars, by about 2030, by about 2035. The Europeans are doing it, the UK is doing it. So there is increased demand for EV. There will be an increased demand for EV vehicles, which of course means less demand for oil. since about 60% of oil demand is actually demanded by transportation, right? So the shift to EV is really going to affect oil exporters. Then oil demand is also going to fall globally because of different emission targets by countries. You want to pollute less carbon dioxide, and so it's not a great idea to burn oil or to use oil. Now, so that goes to part of the myth that oil exporters are finished. And if you look at the graph which I put there, different agencies, oil companies have come up with different projections on when oil demand will fall. And you can see that there are a lot of different variations based on the scenarios, etc. But the point of this graph is to show you that no matter what happens, whichever scenario you use, whichever institution you go for, oil demand will fall by about, say, now even, or at least sometime during the mid-2030s, right? So that's the general projection, even though the exact time may be different. So on the other hand, though, I would caution you from thinking that this is the end for oil exporters, because oil still has a very, very powerful role. If you think about OPEC Plus, right, which is the organization where there are lots of oil exporting countries, they still are an extraordinarily powerful organization. Between July this year and September last week, oil prices rose by 27%, right? And about 3/4 of that, according to JP Morgan, was because OPEC Plus came up with the decision to cut the supply of oil to the world, right? 3/4 of that 20% price rise was due to that OPEC decision, right? So this shows that OPEC Plus still has a lot of power to move oil markets, all right, to account for the fact that when you fill up your ICE cars, you're going to have to pay higher prices for gasoline. The fact that if you go for your year-end holidays in December to Europe or something, you're going to have to pay higher air prices because of higher jet fuel costs. So OPEC, still very powerful, don't write them off. We also see that oil is also very important in terms of the products, the wide range of products which requires some form of oil, some form of refined oil, some kind of an oil product, that goes into making these things. The clothes that you wear, right? The computers that you type on, the plastics that are used in a lot of things, the semiconductor industry, all the things that you see on the chart in front of you, they all depend in some way on oil, right? So you can't escape from oil when you think about a whole wide range of consumer products. Even when you think of renewable energy, right? Renewable energy, in order to produce your solar modules, in order to produce your giant wind turbines, you need certain critical minerals, which you need to mine for, right? And in some countries, there's a huge mining industry for these critical materials that go into producing renewable energy equipment. And how do you mine for them? Well, you use huge diggers, you use huge excavators, you use huge dump trucks for these materials. And what do they run on? Fossil fuels, right? They run on oil in order to power these machines. So again, I think it's premature to say that oil exporters are finished. There's still a very huge role for them, even in a post-oil future. Now, the oil exporters are not resting on their laurels. They're not just crossing their fingers and hoping that, people still are going to need oil. They're actually quite proactive, right? Particularly here in the Gulf, they really are proactive and have come up with certain strategies on how to position themselves so that their products continue to be wanted. Maybe not in the same degree, but that, it's not a zero demand for it. Now, one good example is if you look at the chart there, because of the war in Ukraine, you see that a lot of Gulf exporters who traditionally would export lots of their oil to Asia, they're now actually turning around and exporting diesel, for example, to Europe because of the sanctions that Europe has placed on Russian crude and Russian diesel. So you see that, you know, the Middle East Gulf Middle East oil exporters have actually exploited the situation. They're very savvy, redirected the trade towards Europe, right? But again, they're not just looking at external conditions to keep their oil revenues flowing. They've actually actively taken strategies like trying to decarbonize the oil that they produce. Yes, oil produces carbon dioxide, but they try to reduce the level of carbon dioxide in the oil by various means. A good example is where I live in UAE, the national oil company called ADNOC. They're going to decarbonize the oil they produce by actually getting all the electricity that they use from oil operations from solar and nuclear electricity produced in the UAE. So that when they produce oil, it's no longer from gas-powered power plants, right? But it's from solar and nuclear-based power plants. So that, of course, automatically reduces the carbon content that it takes to produce their oil, since you no longer use gas, to produce that oil. So this is one way in which they are trying to decarbonize oil. Then you will see that other gas producers are putting forward the concept of carbon being circular, right? The idea is that, we can keep reusing carbon, even though we put carbon into the air, but we can actually reuse, recycle, remove, and reduce the amount of carbon that we spew into the air by capturing it from all kinds of high-tech technology, by sucking out the carbon, by reusing the carbon to be injected into oil fields, etc. Okay, so basically, oil producers are not just sitting there, they are also trying to make their oil more marketable in a post-carbon world. We go on to the fourth and probably final assumption. And that assumption, which you hear quite often among climate activists in these kinds of global conferences, that assumption is that oil and gas producers, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, but as a group, oil and gas producers tend to be what they call climate deniers, right? Organizations that refute that climate change is actually happening. They tend to be quite obstructionist in UN climate negotiations. They tend to try to water down the wordings of climate negotiations. They take on all kinds of policies that try to slow down the implementation of climate policies. Some people have accused them of buying into research on climate change to try to influence the outcome of the research. So there are all kinds of accusations that are traditionally thrown at oil and gas producers, right? And even as recently as 2021, a very active group, as you can see there from the picture on the screen, actually, sarcastically awarded Saudi Arabia an award for Fossil of the Day for being obstructionist in some of these global climate change talks, right? So they really are seen as being not very helpful in the whole climate conversation. But like the other assumptions, I think we have to be a bit careful when we tar them with this kind of assumption, because I think we need to acknowledge that the Middle East countries have made some significant improvements and in fact, some sort of contributions maybe to the whole climate debate. And let me just give you a few examples. 2 Gulf countries have hosted or will be hosting the global climate change talks called COP, whatever the number that is, right? So Qatar has hosted a previous edition of the climate change talks. And later this year, the UAE will host the next edition of these climate change talks. Another example I can give you is the fact that if you look at this chart here, this chart will show you that there is an organization that rates how countries do in their climate commitments. You will see the Gulf states, in kind of like the red there. They are seen as, let me see the phrase so I can see correctly. They are rated as being highly insufficient in their climate commitments. Okay, highly insufficient, they're in red. That's Saudi Arabia, clearly highly insufficient. And if you look right at the bottom there, or at the tip of Saudi Arabia, UAE is in orange, which marks it out to be insufficient in its climate policies. So you might say, yeah, see, I told you they were climate deniers. But actually, it's not such a bad situation, because if you look at it comparatively and globally, Indonesia, did you see that in the map, is also colored as being highly insufficient in their climate policies. And Singapore is actually listed as not just highly insufficient, but critically insufficient, right? So, okay, you can say that there are all kinds of reasons why Singapore is critically insufficient in its climate policy. It's small, limited land space, cannot take up renewable energy, etc. While all that is true, the Gulf states can also give you 1,001 reasons why they are listed as being highly insufficient or insufficient in their climate policies. The point here of this chart is actually to show you that they have made progress. If you looked at this same chart, say 10 years ago, right, I think all the Gulf states would be listed as critically insufficient, but they have since made progress in their climate policies, especially by scaling up renewable energy ambitions. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they have targeted that they would like to see 50% of their electricity coming from renewable power by 2050. Okay, that's a lot, 50% by 2050. That's really ambitious, right? Yes, some of you may know that they are quite far in reaching their target at the moment, but nevertheless, that's one of the ambitions. And they're not the only one of ambitions, right? All the Gulf states have ambitions ranging from a more modest 10% to 50% and various degrees in between. The point being, renewables is quite a big thing these days in the Gulf states, right? Another example I can give you of them making significant improvements to the whole climate thing is that a lot of the Middle East countries are vying to produce low carbon hydrogen, because low carbon hydrogen is seen to be the answer to certain industries that are very difficult, in which carbon dioxide is very difficult to reduce. Things like perhaps shipping, things like steel making, in which you need a really high temperature. So a lot of the Gulf states are trying to position themselves as those who can produce low carbon hydrogen cheaply because of their gas, or because of their solar, or because of their nuclear. And Oman, for example, has signed recently about 6 different agreements with international power producers worth about $20 billion to produce green hydrogen in different plants in Oman, because Oman not just has sunshine, it also has got enough wind power, and the two combined can produce a lot of hydrogen. Right, unlike some Middle East countries that have only one resource or the other, but not the two combined. Okay, and you might say, okay, look, well, they're not doing all this because of climate, right? I mean, are there other reasons why they're doing it? Well, it may be true that they're not doing this, all these changes just for the sake of protecting the climate, right? Obviously, there are a lot of economic opportunities for the Middle Eastern countries that want to diversify their economies away from oil and away from gas. So they are looking at hydrogen, they're looking at renewable energies, trading in renewable electricity, trading in carbon, coming up with low carbon steel and aluminum. All these are ways to diversify a hitherto oil and gas dependent economy. So are there other motivations other than, climate? Of course there are, right? But whatever the case is, whatever the motivation, I think it kind of underlines what I'm trying to argue, which is that hydrocarbon producers are not necessarily unfriendly to climate policies, right? In fact, in some cases, it's in their interests to be more aligned with climate policies because they have these ambitions in a post-oil and gas world. So that's my fourth assumption. And for the conclusion, I just want to make a few points here to sum up the conclusion, but also to point out some opportunities for Singapore, not just Singapore companies, for Singapore-based companies and for some Asian companies that have so far been quite reluctant to engage more with the Middle East, right? Because they think it's just all about oil and gas. So the first point I'd like to make is that I hope that you have seen from this presentation that the Middle East is quite a diverse field of countries, right? It's really not just about oil and gas. It's also about other countries. Yes, we haven't talked about them, but it's countries like Morocco, right? Which has got a lot of green stuff going on. They are sending, they want to send electricity from Morocco, which uses quite a lot of hydroelectricity, and they're also having a lot of solar and wind energy. They want to send that via undersea cables to Europe, for example, which is crying out for clean energy. So you have Morocco, so you have this diversity. Turkey, which is producing a lot of cars, for example. So don't go away with thinking that the Middle East is just all about oil and gas. There are other countries in the Middle East that really do other stuff. And the second point is that even among the oil and gas producers, right, which has been the focus of our talk today, even among the oil and gas producers, yes, they do produce oil and gas. And as I hope you have seen through the talk, oil and gas, as I argue, will continue to be very important and relevant in a low carbon world that we are aiming to move towards, right? So their products will still continue to be relevant, continue to be useful, and will continue to help drive some of the uptake in renewable energy because of the critical minerals that I talked about. And these same oil and gas producers, they are also doing different things in their economies, as I've tried to show, you know, not just renewable electricity. They've also tried to do steel, aluminum. They've also have petrochemicals. Some of them even have pharmaceuticals. So they really are doing different things apart from just oil and gas. I'm not arguing that these other things will bring in the same amount as revenue as oil and gas, because clearly oil and gas bring in like lots of revenue, but they are trying to diversify, and hence they could be good partners for, you know, companies in Singapore and in the region. So let me give you an example here. You need to ship gas, right? You need to ship LNG, which is what some of these Middle East producers are looking at producing, liquefied natural gas. You need to ship this liquefied natural gas on special ships. These special ships need to be built. And where are these special ships going to be built? Not in these countries, but actually in countries like South Korea, which has a thriving shipbuilding industry. It will be, you know, a lot of orders have gone to South Korean shipyards. South Korean shipyards are now like overfull. And so some of these orders have actually flowed to Chinese shipyards, right? In order to build these ships, you're going to need things like, you know, steel, aluminum, all kinds of cladding, right? And that again produces opportunities for low carbon steel and, you know, these kinds of products. You're going to need engineering expertise to do all these LNG projects, to do renewable projects. And engineering expertise is something that Singapore companies, Asian companies are really good at, because we do a lot of infrastructure work. So these are just a few ways in which, you know, I hope you can see that even among the oil and gas producers, there are non-oil and gas things that they can do. You need to ship hydrogen, right? Same equation comes into play where you need special ships, special engineering, etc., etc. So I hope that through this talk, give you some idea of the fact that the Middle East is not just oil and gas, but even if it is a lot of oil and gas, they are still very important as, you know, as partners, as investors, as interlocutors in the whole climate change debate. And I think I'll just stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lich and Sim, for this presentation, which brings a lot of nuances on a topic that is quite complex. Let me tell our participants, if you'd like to ask a question, you can write it in the chat box and send it to a MEI event, and then I will collect them and ask them directly to our speaker. While the people start thinking or writing their questions, allow me to use the privilege of the moderation to ask you one question, Lichen, which is on, I would say, the geopolitics of energy, and in particular the consequences of the war in Ukraine. You mentioned that in one of your slides. And for people like me who are not expert at all on energy policies, it looks like the Gulf states were the big winners of what happened after the war in Ukraine and the rise of oil prices. There is also this perception, maybe for bad reasons, that there is a close coordination between Gulf states and Russia. Could you tell us how Gulf states, and in particular maybe Saudi Arabia, has an interest in coordination with Russia or not when it comes to negotiations regarding the production, the energy supplies, the oil prices? So can you tell us a bit on this? Because this is very regularly in the news, but for non-experts people, it's quite difficult sometimes to get exactly what's going on behind the headlines.
Sure, I'll be glad to chip in. So the coordination mechanism takes place on the platform called OPEC Plus, right? So it's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is the original organization. And since 2017, the Plus has come in, and the Plus are the members, non-OPEC members, but they are led by Russia, for example, and they came in to work with OPEC, hence the Plus. They came in to work with OPEC since 2017 to manage the oil market. What that means is basically that they are interested to ensure that there is some level of production that gives them some level of oil price, right? Because, clearly oil producers want to have a decent level of oil prices so that they can earn a decent level of income. In order to make sure that your oil price is at X level, you need to manipulate the production levels, right? So a higher production level, which means there is more oil in the world, will lead to a lower oil price, right? And similarly, a lower production level, because there's less oil in the world, will then, in theory, lead to higher oil prices, right? So that's the mechanism in which they try to basically protect the level of oil prices, okay, because they need it for their economies. I think you saw in one of the slides that a lot of Middle Eastern countries are still very oil dependent, depend on oil revenues. So this is one of the coordination mechanisms that OPEC has with the Plus countries, and they meet regularly. How often they meet dependent on the situation in the different years, but generally they meet, about every couple of months these days to try to hash out what do we do about the oil price, right? In order to know what to do about the oil price, you need to adjust production levels. So each country has a quota, and it says, look, you can only produce so much oil this month, right? So Saudi Arabia and Russia, you can, because you're the big oil producers, you can produce lots of oil, but the others, depending on the amount of oil you can produce, you produce less and less oil. So technically, as a group, we should be able to control how much oil there is in the world in terms of production, and hence come to an agreeable oil price, right? So this is the platform that they use to do negotiations. And you are right that since the Ukraine war, oil prices have increased, right? Partly because of fear, right? Partly because also of European and US sanctions on Russian oil. So there are all these kinds of things which are affecting the price of oil. But yes, Saudi Arabia and Russia in particular, as the two leaders of the OPEC and the Plus, they maintain in very close contact because it is in their interests as the largest oil producers in the world in this particular platform, right? To make sure that they control as much as they can oil prices and hence oil supply levels. So, for example, there was talk of, well, maybe we should not let Russia stay in this organization, right? But it is really in the interest of the Gulf companies that Russia stays within this platform, because even with Russian oil industry declining because of the sanctions, etc., Russia will still be the second largest oil producer within OPEC Plus by far, right? So currently it produces, I think, about 10 million barrels. Saudi is about 11 or 10.5 million after the cuts. So the next largest producer, is around, I think, 5 or 6 million barrels. So no matter how much Russian oil production falls naturally because of declines, they didn't maintain their wells because they're under sanctions, etc., it will not fall down to that level. So whatever it is, Russia will still have a lot of say over oil production and hence oil prices. So it's definitely within the Gulf interest to keep Russia on board, even though Russian oil right now is spilling into Asian markets, which has traditionally been, the so-called, backyard of the Gulf oil producers. The Gulf sends a lot of oil to Asia. So even though Russian oil is competing quite effectively because of low prices, the Gulf states are kind of willing to close one eye because they need Russia to be on board with this mechanism.
Thank you very much for unpacking that issue. Let me move to another question, this one from my colleague Aisha, and that relates to the COP28. And she mentions the fact that the UN recently released a report on global stock take, highlighting the importance of phasing out fossil fuels in order to keep 1.5 degrees warming within reach. The question for you, Dr. Lichen, is, do you think that the UAE will push for this terminology of phasing out in during the COP28 and obviously in the final document that will come with the summit? Okay,
that's a great question. And I love these UN summits and negotiations because that's when you realize that words are very, very important, right? That the kind of words you put into these statements and declarations are super, super important, even though to lay observers like us, you're like, what's the difference, right? So in this case, you're right. UN has put out the word phasing out of fossil fuels. But what the UAE is trying to do is to add a word there that says phasing out of unabated fossil fuels, right? Now, the word unabated here is absolutely key. Unabated fossil fuels is different from fossil fuels, right? Unabated fossil fuels means fossil fuels that are produced however, right? Abated fossil fuels are those which are produced whereby the carbon is reduced by capturing it, by reducing it, by producing electricity rather than gas, So what they're saying is that not all fossil fuels are the same. The UAE would like to phase out unabated fossil fuels because the UAE can produce abated fossil fuels, right? So the UAE can produce greatly decarbonized fossil fuels. Hence, it should be allowed to continue producing fossil fuels because they are not endangering, the climate policy as much as those like, say, Iraq, which continues to put out gas into the atmosphere when it produces oil. Hence, that is unabated fossil fuels. So wording here, right, semantics is really, really important. And Aisha, to answer your question, I think the UAE will push for the word phasing out unabated. Of course, there's going to be a huge negotiation, discussions. They're going to have to give something up to other countries in order to get that through. And I think the process already started. They have, agreed that they would put in a huge chunk of money for Africa so that Africa can have more financing for its renewable energy. They have already agreed with the US that they will also put in more, financing in various clean energy projects. So these are some of the ways pre-COP that they are trying to get stakeholders to come around to accepting the word, unabated into the phrase. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to a question from Ambassador Georgi Bustin, who's pointing out the contradiction or the tension between oil prices and energy transition. And he's asking you, don't you think that significantly lower oil prices de-incentivize green energy transition? So coming back actually to a topic that is at the core of your presentation. So what do you make of this, and how does that maybe influence the current policies of the Gulf states?
Okay, again, a great question. Obviously, a tension between the two. It's traditionally assumed that, high oil prices could could speed up the energy transition for consumers, right? That would be from the consumer perspective, whereas low oil prices, will not make them to be so, it won't be so urgent for consumers to then embrace the energy transition because there's, lower, when you look at your bills, there's lower bills, they don't really care. But from the perspective of oil producers, right? So that was oil consumers. But if you look from the perspective of oil producers, right, the fact that in future, they sit here at their screen, they look at all these models, and believe you me, they've done all the modeling. When they look at these models done by the IEA, done by OPEC Plus, etc., and they see that in future, oil prices could be very low because of lower demand, right, because of electrification, etc., they are scared, right? They are very fearful of that low prices. Models have predicted, for example, that the oil amount of revenues that they get now is going to plunge, depending on which country, by as much as 10%, 90%, 80%, that kind of thing. Imagine if your revenues in 20 years' time drop down to 20% of the level you have now. Now, that's causing a lot of worry, okay? So in that sense, when oil producers look at the future of low oil prices, not oil consumers, but oil producers, they realize that they kind of need to do something to try to get on the bandwagon of energy transition, right? Whether it's trying to slow it down or trying to embrace renewable energy so that they can sell more oil and gas now when the price is high, rather than wait to when the price is low. Right, so they're actually incentivized because they look at future low oil prices and think, oh my gosh, we're going to have to sell oil now because in future it's so low. Let's produce as much as we can right now. Let's invest as much money as we can right now to expand our oil and gas fields. So in that sense, it depends on whose perspective you look at. But either way, I think the energy transition is I guess it's kind of inevitable in the long run. It's just about, the speed and the pace, that kind of thing, financing.
Thank you. Another question and another maybe a contradiction or tension in the energy policies of the Gulf states. Lam Wenhu Padraig from the audience is asking about the fact that despite most of the Middle East oil being transported by sea, why is it that those countries did not build up their own navies to protect their sea lanes and instead over-rely on external naval powers? So why is it that those that secure the supplies, the oil supplies, are not those countries, but they're foreign partners? How do you explain that historically or maybe politically?
Okay. Chinru, that's a really great question. And the answer to that would be, as Jean-Lu hinted, because of their foreign partners, right? The Gulf states for decades have been very close, particularly to with the British first, and then now the Americans. Americans have a huge presence here in the region in terms of air bases, in terms of naval bases. And so basically the Gulf did not really have to build up a substantial navy to protect the transport of oil and gas through pirate-infested waters, to get to Asia, because you had the Americans doing the job, right? You have the French pitching in from time to time, the British pitching in from time to time, depending on the wars and the situations. So you even have Singapore pitching in, right, with the counterterrorism piracy force, and so a lot of other stakeholders in the region are happy to pitch in because they depend on those oil supplies getting through to their own countries, right? So in that sense, I guess the words that we tend to use when we describe the situation is free riding. If others are going to do it for you, particularly the Americans, right, then why do you need to put resources into doing it yourself? Much better for you to put those resources into increasing investments in oil and gas, for example. So the short answer is that they have foreign partners willing to take on that role.
That's a fascinating point. And would you say, and that's more my own interpretation, would you say that if we look at it as this free riding phenomenon, that in fact China enjoys the US naval presence, that the fact that you have the US providing that kind of global free insurance for the shipping of oil supplies is of benefit for China?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one reason why I think neither China nor even Russia, for that matter, want to upset the current status quo, because they benefit from not just the sea lane protection, and it's not just oil and gas, right? It's vital communications, sea lines of communications, right? So even they benefit from the stability that the American military provides. So not just for ships, but for piracy, for terrorism, etc. So yes, there is this wider benefit that comes from the American protection, and I don't see the Chinese wanting to take on this role, because then it means that they have to invest in a bigger navy, which is here most of the time, and most of the time they're not here now, right? And that will take away resources from the South China Sea, which is where their core interests lie, because it's in the backyard.
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating conversation. The next question I have relates to the clean energy transition, and the question is: do you think that clean energy transition will actually perpetuate the energy geopolitics for the GCC? And I assume the underlying assumption here is that we will see a lot of the same things between the rivalries, with regards to the rivalries among Gulf states when it comes to their oil and gas policies, the same way for the energy transition. Do you think that this is the way things are evolving now?
It's a great question, because it talks about intra-Gulf rivalry, right? That's the big picture. And so far that we've seen, even if we ignore oil and gas for a moment, ignore the renewable energy, clean energy, Gulf states are rivals, right? They all have airplanes, right? The national air carriers are competing, from Qatar to UAE to Saudi. These states are going to compete. They compete in terms of free zones, right? They compete in terms of free zones. UAE has lots of free zones, so does Oman, so does every other country in the Gulf, and they all offer very similar incentives, etc. So even before clean energy, they were big rivals, right? With clean energy, yes, there's also this intra-Gulf rivalry in terms of hydrogen. So UAE, for instance, wants to capture something like 1/4 of the global hydrogen market in future, right? Oman has around the same ambition, except for clean hydrogen, whereas UAE, it's a mix of gas and green hydrogen. Saudi Arabia, of course, the big one in the region, also wants to capture a huge share of the green hydrogen pie. So yes, you have these Gulf states all competing in this area. And in a way, it's not surprising, right? Because they are oil producers. They have similar strategies on what to do in a post-oil future, whether it's economic zones or airlines or hydrogen. So in that sense, the fact that they have similar policies is not surprising because there's only so many strategies you can come up with as a response. So yes, I think that the intensity of intra-Gulf rivalry is just going to increase.
Thank you. The next question is, it relates to a recent announcement. You probably heard about the new project that was promoted during the J20 summit about the India-Middle East corridor. And it does have an energy dimension, though there is a lot of skepticism, or let's say discussion, on how this will actually be translated in terms of logistics, infrastructures. How do you look at this type of initiative, which looks like a counter or an alternative to the China Belt and Road Initiative? Do you think that this has the potential to change the energy geopolitics of the region, or that it's more a diplomatic narrative?
Okay, another great question. So this new initiative that came out of the G20, I mean, it's not the only so-called new alternative transport routes, the BRI, right? There have been many different transport routes being proposed. For example, the north-south transport that comes from Russia all the way to India, that's also a big one that's being proposed, and that will probably link up to this new proposal in some way. Even the North Sea route, right? You have shipping routes, not just a land transport, but the shipping route that goes around the sea from Russia to Asia. That's also an alternative, albeit maritime transport route rather than an overland. So there is no shortage of alternatives to the BRI. Yes, we can see it as an alternative to the BRI, but I'm not really sure whether we would say it's a competitor, right? Or viable competitor, because obviously the BRI comes with a lot of money, right? That is ready finance. You have one country that basically finances the whole thing. Not sure in the G20 version who is going to finance it, right? BRI was easy, it was China. But in G20, you have many different actors who perhaps are waiting for each other to finance it. They may not have as deep pockets as China. And then you have the free rider problem, right? Who wants to finance the most of it? Because then the rest will benefit as well. So, so yes, forgive me if I'm, a little bit skeptical, but, these kinds of projects are really, really expensive. And in order to make these projects viable, you need the end users, right? So if you don't have end users already in place, then the financiers are not going to come in to finance a project because there may not be enough end users. So I think that these projects are a little bit a diplomatic narrative, but also I think it shows how India and the Gulf states are also thinking about, what are the different ways we can do to diversify our partnerships, right? And these are just thought processes sometimes, but I think they're very useful because they show that we're not just going to keep relying on the same stakeholders the whole time. And they are thinking about the future, about who others can contribute.
Thank you very much. And as you said, I mean, it's usually the moment when you discuss the bill and who's going to pay for the bill that partnerships can become more complicated. Let me turn to probably the last question, if we have time, which is going back to the energy transition. And the question is, oil will continue to play a role in the future, but what are the other measures and tools oil producers can adopt in preparation for a future with reduced oil demand?
Okay, another great question. Oil producers have a variety of strategies, and I think I did hint at some of these strategies in the presentation. So just to recap, oil producers can try to decarbonize their oil and hence make them more attractive for countries that are focused on the greenness of the oil that they import, right? So if you can show that the oil that, say, Europe imports from the UAE is greener than the one that they import from Indonesia, okay, maybe the UAE has more of a chance because they can show that the oil is greener. Now, how do they show the oil is greener? It's one thing to say, hey, look, I'm producing it using solar and nuclear, but how do you prove it, right? Because you need to prove that. You can't just claim it. Now, in this sense, some of these Gulf states are quite advanced in trying to certify the greenness of their claims. So they actually have certification bodies, internationally recognized certification bodies, which actually come in and they do like audits and checks and verifications and issue certificates that, you know, this claim is correct, right? And they will issue a certificate to say that, you know, I don't know, 1 ton of oil was produced using solar energy, for example. So the Gulf states have been quite keen in coming up with these verification and monitoring policies, and that's a really good thing for them, right? Another thing which they have done is, of course, about the circular carbon that I mentioned, right? They're pushing this idea that we can still produce carbon, but we can try to reuse the carbon so that it doesn't keep going, it doesn't keep adding to the carbon, right? We can keep using it, we can try to suck out of the air. And if you look at the numbers, the Gulf states are very active in financing projects that try to suck out carbon from the atmosphere, not just to suck up, but to store it permanently underground, right? And they're doing it, as I said, partly because of climate, but really it's to protect their oil, right? They have to market it and show our oil is produced using carbon-friendly purposes. We don't just produce oil and spew it into the atmosphere, the carbon, we actually capture that carbon. So again, it makes oil from, you know, the Gulf states more attractive than oil from, say, Iraq, right? Which doesn't have the financing to do these kinds of projects that can capture or suck up the carbon. So they're doing a lot of these policies that basically ensures they are the last man standing. In a green world, they are the ones whose oil will be in demand because their oil is, well, green, not really green, but low carbon, right? And as I said before, oil is going to be needed still for a wide range of things. If you can prove that your oil is, you know, lower carbon than your rivals, then I think you have, you know, one foot in the door among consumers who still need oil.
Thank you. Another question that comes from the audience, from Richard Wong, who's asking about the link between oil and the US currency, the US dollar, and the fact that for historically that there has been a close relationship between oil transactions and US dollar. And how do you see that evolving? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was, I think for the first time a few months ago, the UAE making a transaction in the Chinese currency. So how do you see the evolution between, let's say, oil transactions and the primacy of the US dollar until now?
Okay, great question, and one that's certainly very topical. So yes, transactions or payments for oil have been made not just in yuan, but also in rupees, right? There are attempts to try to de-dollarize the oil trade, and that has led some people to say, hey, you know, are we seeing the end of the US dollar in oil, right? But also don't forget that the US is actually the largest producer of oil. We tend to forget that, right? We tend to think that it's Saudi Arabia that is the world's largest producer of oil, but actually it's not true. It's the US. It's just that the US doesn't export as much as Saudi because US consumes, much of its own oil. But in any case, it still means that the US dollar, particularly in the Gulf, will still reign supreme. Why? Because the US dollar is pegged to all of the Gulf economies except to Kuwait, which I believe operates on a basket of currencies that kind of floats. But still the US dollar is the biggest component, but unlike the other Gulf states, it's not the only component, right? So for many, many decades, for example, the exchange rate between UAE dirham and the US dollar has remained the same, right? Jean-Louis, you were here a few years ago. It has not changed. It's the same rate. So I don't see the Gulf states depegging from the US dollar anytime soon, because it gives them a kind of stability. They don't really have to manage too much their own inflation or monetary policy, because it kind of like follows the US trend. If the US raises the rate, they also raise the rate, right? So it makes it a bit easier for them. But also the Gulf states have lots and lots of investments in the US, in Europe even, right? Tons of investments there, whether it's in electric car companies or whether it's in all these chip making companies or various other real estate things in the US and Europe. So if they're going to de-dollarize, that's going to also affect quite a bit of that relationship, right? UAE also holds a lot of hard currency, and a lot of it is US dollars as well. So I don't see them de-dollarizing, although of course they could. Yes, I think it makes sense to have some of these trades done in local currencies. Sure, why not, right? But I think on the whole, although they might trade more using other currencies, I don't think that will endanger the dominance of the US dollar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee Chen-Sim. This will be, believe wait, I actually have a last question that is asked from the audience. If we have about 3 minutes, so we can very quickly. Could you speak about the emerging carbon market in the GCC? Will this be a new source of income?
Okay,
that's the question.
Excellent question. So yes, so carbon trading, okay, specific carbon trading is one of the very, very emergent themes that we find pre-COP, right? So in the run-up to COP, there have been a lot of noise about using carbon markets here, because they want to trade in them to make them more effective, to make companies actually realize that there's a price to be paid for carbon, and that you can trade it to make it more efficient and effective and profitable. Right. In fact, there was a Singapore company called ACX that started, Singapore-based company that started in Singapore to trade carbon, and they have since moved to Abu Dhabi, and they are now using the platforms in Abu Dhabi to try and trade carbon, because they found a more, I suppose, welcoming environment there with the oil and gas companies and carbon. So yes, carbon trading is certainly something that's going on. A new organization was set up recently called Net Zero Emissions Trading Association, and they are also interested in trading carbon. So you have a whole slew, and it was a very well-attended launch, right? From a lot of businesses. I was partly involved. I was as a host looking at this organization. So I can tell you that carbon trading is a huge thing here in the Gulf, particularly in the run-up to COP28, where I could be totally wrong, but one of my bets is that the big news that will come off COP28 is that the UAE will set a carbon price. Right, a bit like Singapore, it may start off with a very low carbon price, but at least there will be some kind of intention, I suppose, that they are moving in this direction to price carbon. So, we will see a very, I think, intense discussion about carbon moving forward in the Gulf.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sim, and this will be the last word of this talk, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to verify your bet on the next COP, which is happening not very far from now, just a few weeks from now. This, as I said, concludes our session. We meet next week again on Zoom for the next lecture, which will be on a great topic, a new addition to our on our Middle East 101 course, which is on the role of women and youth as a force of change in the Middle East. So fascinating topic that I encourage everyone to attend. Again, Dr. Li Chen, thank you very much for being with us today. And we hope to see you very soon, either in Singapore or on Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye to everyone.